where you can't lower interest rates anymore, let's say you hit zero, you hit that part of the cycle ends. So then you go to a deleveraging. Now a deleveraging, deleveraging means that you can't raise debt relative to income anymore. When you can't raise debt relative to income anymore, the cycle begins to work in reverse. So I think that people, if they don't do a very good job of calculating incrementally what the effects are on demand, but let's say you're having debt growth at something like 10%, and you go to a 5% debt growth instead, that has a negative effect on growth. It's the marginal change from that level produces a negative effect on growth. So traditionally in deleveragings, that negative effect that happens on, for let's say Europe is a very classic case, the Spanish banking system is a very classic case, the European banking system. As banks leverage up at a certain rate, and they can't leverage up more than that rate, and they lessen the rate at which they're leveraging it up, it has the effect of beginning a deleveraging. Deleveraging means then the income, the spending, all produces sort of a negative cycle. That produces the beginning of a depression. A depression is the phase of a deleveraging in which there's a combination of austerity and debt restructuring. Because if you have, it's a basic thing, if you have too much debt to service, you've got to do something about it. And when you have too much debt to service and you do something about it, there are a limited number of things that you can do. You can either transfer the debt, you can transfer resources from the rich to the poor, so you can have it transferred, from example, from Germany to Spain. That's one way of dealing with it. The other way is you have a combination of austerity and debt restructurings. A debt restructuring means that you lower the debt in one fashion or another. You lower the debt burden to something that you can afford to service because of the income that you produce. Restructurings can take one of three ways. You can either actually write down the debt. You write down the debt, let's say write it down in half, because you could service half. If you service half, but the problem is one man's debts are another man's assets. So when you write it down in half, you have a big negative wealth effect. So you have a negative wealth effect, you can't borrow money, it has that problem. So a restructuring becomes a problem. You could restructure it either in the form of writing it down, or in one way or another, you can lengthen the payments, or you can forcibly lower the interest rate. But some way or another, you've got to get the payments in line for what the cash flows are producing so that you can service that kind of a debt. That's a very painful process. So a depression is the phase of the deleveraging when there's a combination of austerity and writing down debts. So classic depression, 1930 to 1932, March of 1933, we print money. So the third way that you can deal with it is you can print money, essentially what we call print money. The printing of money means that essentially a central bank, debt is a commitment to deliver money. So if a central bank slips into the system a certain amount of money each year, it can make that easier. Think about the debt write-down, that something maybe is a debt, and you say, I'm going to write it down to a level that could be sustainable, and you write it down by 50%. That has a big negative wealth effect. Big deal. Bad. If it's 10-year debt, maybe that's equivalent to 5% a year for 10 years. If you slip in 5% a year instead, and to that person who then can pay that debt, they can service the debt, it's 5% a year, it's not that big a deal. And so in all deleveragings, in the end, they print money. It's part of the mix. Now, the best deleveragings are ones in which you have a balance of those things. Ultimately, you have to bring down the debt-to-income ratio. So, and the ways that ultimately you'll have a balance of those three things. Those three things, again, you're going to have a certain amount of transfer of wealth. You're going to have a certain amount, let's call them four things, a certain amount of austerity, a certain amount of debt write-downs, and a certain amount of printing of money. The debt write-downs and the austerity are deflationary. The printing of money is inflationary. If you can get the balance right of those things, then you have what I call a beautiful deleveraging. A deleveraging. Well, when you look at the deleveraging, the debt-to-income ratios. Thank you, I'm fine. If you look at the debt-to-income ratios and say, how have they come down over time? England after World War II, or the United States in the Great Depression. In all of these cases where the debt-to-income ratios came down, they came down. How did they come down? They came down with relatively good conditions by trying to get by that mix. There's a certain, the number one reason is that there's enough of a printing of money that the nominal growth rate in GDP has to exceed the nominal interest rate. Okay, because think about it, you have a certain amount of debt and there's a certain debt service cost. And if that interest rate on the debt is higher than the nominal GDP rate, then that means that it's going to compound unless you keep cutting, and that produces a negative consequence. So the most important thing is in these deleveragings, as the United States is now doing, is that you have enough of a printing of money to produce a nominal growth rate that's above the nominal interest rate over a period of time. I'm oversimplifying, but that's the most important single thing.